The book of Esther. We're going to hopefully finish this tonight. I think Brother Larry didn't have a whole lot of hope that I'd be able to get through 4 chapters, but chapter 10, lower that a little bit. Chapter 10 is only 3 verses long, so. And also, Erin has a friend at her work that we want to keep in prayer too. Her name is Emily Christman. She's 30 years old, and she was just diagnosed with breast cancer. So, pretty young, and obviously very scary situation for her and her family. So, please be in prayer for her as well. But back to Esther. So, we'll kind of go through and do the Cliff's Notes version up to where we left off. We started out with King Ahasuerus, King Xerxes, the king of Persia and Media, in huge area, provinces, spanning from India all the way into Egypt, lots of people, lots of different nationalities, a lot of power. And he liked showing people his power. He liked bragging about his power, so he had a big 6-month war party where they were planning on their next invasion. And he had a big party there, and then after that party, he had another 7-day party for all the people there in the land of Shushan, in the capital city there where he was staying. And at that party, too much to drink, bad decisions, as clearly we've talked about, are made when consuming alcohol recreationally. He decides he's going to call his queen in, who's beautiful, wear a crown, show off his prize, show off his wife to his people there that are at a party with him. She refuses. So he talks to his wise men, who tell him, well, you can't let her do that, because if she doesn't listen to you, then none of the women in any of the land will listen to any of the men, and then you're just going to have chaos, and nothing's going to go right, king. You can't stand for that. You got to get rid of her. So he does. He boots her out, banishes her from the kingdom, and then they decide a little while later, he gets sad about it. He remembers Vashti, and seems like maybe he's kind of regretting his decision. And so the wise men once again hop to him and say, well, why don't you have a beauty contest, get you a new wife, and just that way you can forget about Vashti. And so he does. He gets all the most beautiful women of the land. They come to one of his houses there in Shushan. They have a 1-year-long beauty, 1-year-long beauty camp that they go to, I guess, 6 months of skin care and perfumes and, a whole year of beauty to get ready to see the king. Long story short, we know that Esther wins that contest. King Ahasuerus is impressed with her. He is very pleased with her. He, kind of falls in love with her immediately. And, we talked about her beauty on the outward side, obviously, and then also on the inward. She was obviously a very nice person, kind person. She listened well. She took advice well. She was obviously someone, because everyone in the story that meets her likes her. No matter what situation she's in, she has that inner spirit that people like. And so she wins the contest. She becomes a queen, but Mordecai, who was her cousin and her caregiver that's taking care of her because her parents were killed or dead at this point, tells her not to tell anybody that she's a Jew. And so she doesn't. And then one day Mordecai is sitting at the gate. He hears a couple people talk about how they want to kill the king because they're mad at the king. And Mordecai gets word to Esther, who then gets word to the king. Mordecai saves the day, and Haman gets promoted. Not really sure how that happens, but that's how the story goes. Mordecai saves the day. Haman gets promoted. We found out that Haman was an Agite, is what the Bible calls him. Most likely one of the Amalekites, mortal enemy of the Israelites throughout all the Old Testament. And so Haman was not a good man, but he had been promoted. As he comes to the king's court the one day, everyone bows down like the king commanded because Haman was a great guy. Everyone loved him. He was important except for Mordecai. Mordecai would not show him reverence. We talked about throughout this lesson, throughout this story, it's a narrative. It tells us a lot of facts. It tells us what happens, but it doesn't give us motivations or the thinking of why the people are doing what they're doing. And so oftentimes we are tempted to put our own motivations into what the people are doing. But the Bible doesn't tell us why a lot of these things happened or what was going through these people's mind as they were doing what they were doing. But Mordecai won't bow to Haman. So Haman gets mad at Mordecai and decides he's going to get Mordecai. He's going to kill Mordecai. Not only kill Mordecai, but kill all the Jews throughout the entire land of the Media and Persia, which is most of the Jews living in the world, because that did include Israel. And at this point, the children of Israel had been exiled. They were spread throughout the kingdom, but they had been allowed to go back to Jerusalem. Many had gone back to the promised land. Not everyone had. But this would have wiped out a significant amount of Jews throughout the land. Significant enough that Haman said he would give the king lots and lots and lots and lots of silver in order to pull this off. We talked about last week that it would be equivalent to around $200 million, if you can believe what the the exchange rates from 400 BC till now. The king okays this without even knowing what he's okaying, right? He says, Here's my ring. Yeah, we can't have people like that living in my kingdom that have their own set of rules, that don't do what I tell them to do, that don't believe the same way that we do. Yeah, go ahead, do whatever you want to do, and make sure you get that silver into my bank account. We see throughout the entire thing that King Ahasuerus is a man that is just ruled by emotion. He is not a good leader. He's not a good person. He is a big character throughout this entire book, but everything is impulsive. Everything is whatever the guy in front of him is talking about. Not a good man, doesn't think things through, but he decides, go ahead. So Mordecai finds out about the decree. He's upset about it. He goes into the main area there in town and is wailing and crying and making sure that everyone knows what is going on. Now, Esther, even though she's the queen, she's obviously not a queen in the way we think of queens. As far as ruling and having authority, she didn't even seem to know what was going on. So she sends her guy that takes care of her from the king's house down to Mordecai. Mordecai, what's wrong? He tells him what's wrong. He says, now you have to do something about this. And Esther says, I can't do anything about this because the king hasn't talked to me in a month, and I can't just walk into the king. He's going to kill me. What good am I doing? Mordecai comes back to Esther again, and he says, you really think you can get away with this? The Jews are going to be saved, Mordecai tells her. And I believe that that is obviously a lot of faith in the Lord and the Lord's protection. And he knew that the Lord was going to take care of the Jewish people because he knew the Abrahamic promise, the covenant that God had with Israel. So he had faith. He said, saved one way or the other. But are you and your family going to be remembered in this process? Or is it going to have to come another? And it's me. All right. Good? All right. So, Mordecai tells Esther, it's going to happen one way or the other. Do you want to be in on it? And he gives her the advice in verse 14 of chapter 4 that we talked about, how this is kind of the focal point of the entire book and the biggest lesson for us, I think, to learn throughout this entire story is in chapter 4, verse 14, where he says, "And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" For such a time as this. God has put you in the position that you are in for this purpose right now. Doesn't matter how you got here. Doesn't matter who you are, how you got here, what you did, whether the decisions were right, wrong. You are where you are now. Are you going to do something with it? So Esther agrees. She says, gets her prayer warriors on it, tells them to start fasting, and that she will then go into the king and talk to him and make it so that she can talk to the king about it. Then we see Haman's arrogance over Mordecai once again. Haman's so bitter, he can't enjoy his dinner that he has with the queen and king on the first night of banquet that Queen Esther has for him. And so on the way out, he sees Mordecai again. He goes home to his wife, and he's telling his wife and his family and all these people about this horrible Jew, Mordecai, and how that he just can't stand him. He won't give him reverence. And he said, and we've already thrown lots to find out when we're going to kill all the Jews, and it's not for like a year, so I can't give him that. And they said, well, if this guy is such a pain, why don't you just go ahead and get rid of him now? Just go talk to the king, tell him what you want done, and you're important. You're important, Haman. So Haman decides, you know what? You're right. I'm going to do it. So he gets gallows, the Bible says, 50 cubits high, which is 75 feet. Now, once again, the translation on that, gallows, we think of like a noose, like Old West kind of thing. This seems to me like it's more like a stake, where they impaled people on a stake. So, and from what I've studied about it, 7-story stick with a guy sitting at the top of it. This is what his plan was for Mordecai. And for some reason, I just thought like I could see in my mind the musical of Haman singing like, kill him, kill him, kill him. And then on the other screen, it would cut to the king remembering Mordecai, reading the Chronicles and remembering that Mordecai saved his life, and he's like, "No, praise him, praise him." I don't know why that contrast there came to me, but I mean, literally at the same time, this is what's going on. Haman's going, "I'm going to kill him," and King Ahasuerus is like, "Well, this guy, he really did a service for me, and we never gave him any credit for it." So at the same time, these things are going on. And so Haman goes in to talk to the king early in the morning. The king's just read this, and he's like, "What are we going to do for Mordecai?" And he goes, "Is there anybody out there?" They go, "Yeah, Haman's out there." He's like, "Oh, we'll bring him in. Haman, this guy I love. What should I do for him? I mean, he's a great guy. He's done some wonderful things. I really like him. I want to praise him. What should I do?" Of course, Haman thinks that he's talking about him, and so he goes through with everything that he would want. The king's horse, the king's crown, a herald walking in front of him saying, "Hey, this is the guy the king loves." And then he finds out he's got to do that for Mordecai. And that's kind of where we left off. With Mordecai being pranced through the street, with Haman in front of him going, "This is the guy that the king loves." He probably didn't say it very cheerfully, I imagine. He was probably very distraught about it. He goes home. He tells his wife what had happened. And then let's pick up here in chapter 7. And we'll read 1 through 4 here. And the king and Haman and Esther are at banquet once again. So 7, 1 through 4. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen. And the king said again unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, "What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to half the kingdom." Then Esther the queen answered and said, "If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondsmen and bondswomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage." So for the third time, the king says to Esther, "What do you want?" Once again, impulsive king, all emotion. He's sitting there with his beautiful wife. "What do you want? I've asked you half the kingdom. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you. This time, Esther comes back with an answer. And she says, I want you to save my life and the life of my people, because we've been sold. Referring to the amount of money that Haman had given to the king in exchange for all their deaths. She said, we've been sold to be destroyed. Now, if we were just going to be slaves, I wouldn't even mention this to you, king. If we were just a slavery kind of thing, I wouldn't even talk about it. But, I mean, we're going to be killed here. We're going to be put to death. Verse 5 and 6. Then the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther the queen, who is he, and where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is the wicked Haman. Then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. So Ahasuerus, once again, he's like, what kind of person would do this? What kind of guy would make this kind of a bad decision? Who is he? Now, Esther really could have said it was you, because in his impulsiveness, he had just given Haman whatever, ring, gave him his ring and said, yeah, do whatever you want to do to the people. Probably a good decision not to blame it on the king there. So she calls Haman out to his face. And she says it was Haman. Verse 7 through 10. And the king, arising from the banquet of wine in his wrath, went into the palace garden, and Haman stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen, for he saw there was evil determined against him by the king. Then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. Then said the king, will he force the queen also before me in the house? As the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, behold also the gallows, 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king. It standeth in the house of Haman. Then the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So the king's obviously mad at Haman. He storms out of the room. He's in the garden, probably pacing back and forth. What am I going to do to this guy? I like him. He was important, but he's all mad. And when he comes back in the room, Esther was sitting there on the couch, and Haman was laying down on the couch next to her. He was begging for her life, but, king came in and saw Haman, laying basically laying right there by his wife or on his wife or however that was. And he's like, what? Words barely got out of his mouth. They put the hood on him. They took him out. The hood, that obviously means in everything, you're going to die. It's over for you. And I wonder if the chamberlain there that was standing there that said, hey, remember that Mordecai? You just had a whole thing where you got to ride around the town on the horse and you praised him and he had done good for you. Haman was actually here trying to kill him on some gallows. I wonder if it was the same guy that went and got Haman the night before, or right before the dinner, and brought him to the meal. I wonder if the guy didn't, there had to be some history there, right? They knew each other. He didn't hesitate to say, hey, you know what Haman did? He's probably looking forward for this opportunity for a long time, because Haman was obviously not a good person. So he says, you know what? Harbona tells him, he said, Mordecai, who thou like. He was going to try to kill Mordecai. And so the king says, go ahead, get those gallows to good use. Let's go ahead and let's take Haman out on them. And it says the king was pacified again. Because once again, this king, raw emotion, no intellect, no decision making, nothing, a great example to us in horrible leadership and bad decision making. Whoever's standing in front of him, whoever's saying whatever they're saying, just doing whatever they say. Bad decisions. So the king was pacified, and now we'll go here into chapter 8. We'll read verses 1 and 2. On that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jews' enemy unto Esther the queen.
And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. And the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So Haman is dead now, and the king gives all of Haman's stuff, all of his property, everything, to Queen Esther. And Esther gives Mordecai that land to take care of it in that house. And so Mordecai is now in charge of Haman's property. And also the king, before he had Haman put up on the gallows, grabbed that ring that he had given to him, and now he gave that ring to Mordecai. So now Mordecai has the power of the king in his hand, kind of like Haman had. Only Mordecai is going to make better use of it. 3-6. And Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king, and said, If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and the king seem right, and the things seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people, or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? So here we see the king once again sitting in his throne room, and Esther not being invited. She's getting pretty comfortable with her courage now, right? She's getting emboldened. And Haman's dead, Haman's gone, but that decree still stands. The Jews are still on pace to be utterly obliterated. And Esther obviously can't deal with that. She said, I still have my kindred to worry about. I still have. And this is a big ask for Esther. We've already well established the law of the land. The king, who considered himself a god, when he made a decree, it couldn't be reversed. This is the biggest ask we see out of Esther to the king. This is her knowing what she's saying, hey, I know this is really going to mess up your kingship, your little g godship. I know this is against everything that you stand for, everything that your country has proclaimed, everything that you've proclaimed. This is a big thing that she's saying to him. I want you to reverse this, even though I know you can't, even though I know it's never been done, it's unprecedented. She's pretty bold in her questionings here to the king. She wants him to turn this thing around, because although Haman's gone, she's still in trouble, her and her kindred. And she doesn't want this to happen. And she's begging the king. And he does tip the scepter to her once again, as we see. And she is able to ask this question. So, let's read 7 through, probably down through 14. Let's see. Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name, and sealed with the king's ring, may no man reverse. So he says to him, he's like, look, I'm not going to reverse it. He said, but write your own law. Write your own decree. You got my ring. Go ahead and do whatever you need to do. Because I've already taken care of Haman. So do what you need to do. Then were the king's scribes called at that time in the 3rd month, that is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day thereof. And it was written according to all that Mordecai commanded unto the Jews, and to the lieutenants and the deputies and rulers of the provinces, which are from India all the way into Ethiopia, 127 provinces, unto every province according to the writing thereof, and unto every people after their language, and to the Jews according to their writing and according to their language. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name, and sealed it with the king's ring, and sent letters by post on horseback, and riders on mules, camels, and young dromedaries, wherein the king granted the Jews, which were in every city, to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. Upon one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, namely, upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar. The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, and that the Jews should be ready against the day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So the posts that rode upon mules and camels went out, being hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment, and the decree was given at Shushan the palace. So, king says, I can't do anything about the law I've already okayed. It's got the seal on it, but write your own decree. And so Mordecai comes up with his own decree. If you read Mordecai's decree, it pretty much sounds exactly like Haman's, only it is the Jews can defend themselves and take the spoils just like Haman had planned on doing. And so they had their horseback pony express, out to all the provinces from Egypt, 127, all the way over into India, everyone in their own language and their own writing, and he wanted to make sure that everyone knew. And this gave the Jews the authority to assemble themselves together and to protect themselves. Because it wasn't lawful for any group of people to create their own militia in the land. I mean, that would be stupid for the king to allow that. He would not typically allow great numbers of people to come together to create their own army that were not under his service. And we see Mordecai here gaining in authority, gaining in power. King Ahasuerus is giving him this authority and this power to help the Jews protect themselves, band themselves together, and kill anybody that thinks that they can kill them and take their stuff. This is, once again, a crazy government that we have here that we're reading have. The Jews will have months to prepare for this. They're excited. But the king is basically just saying, I want a civil war in my land. It's just ludicrous. Once again, horrible leadership. It's not just, the government's not just bad in America sometimes. I mean, he's okaying a civil war within his land. But this is the decision that he's come to. And then we'll go ahead and we'll finish out this chapter 15 through 17. And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day, and many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So we see a lot of people converted to Judaism over this entire expression of joy and pleasure and happiness. We see another big contrast here where Mordecai not that long ago was in sackcloth and ashes, and now he is arrayed in the kingly apparel. He's got the robe on. He's the hand of God. Throughout all this, we see God working. No, there's no talking about God working, right? It seems like God's quiet, but we see the hand of God taking control over this entire situation. And Mordecai is gaining in influence and gaining in power. The Jews are excited, and they're happy that they are going to be able to defend themselves. Verse 1 in chapter 9. Now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. And that's kind of the way things happen a lot in life, right? plans never go as to the way that you make them. Nothing ever works out exactly as planned. And when we are planning to do evil, it typically comes back to bite us. It'll always come back to bite us, we know, right? But sometimes we don't see it, sometimes we don't acknowledge it. But plans don't always go, and when we think to do evil, the Lord has his own plans and can turn them upside down. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt, and no man could withstand them, for the fear of them fell upon all people. And all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and the officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. Here we continue to see the importance of Mordecai, the strength of Mordecai, him reaching a high level in King Ahasuerus' kingdom, and how that the government and all the little provinces decided, you know what? We better not back this evil decree of Haman, because it don't look like it's going to work out too well for him. We need to support Mordecai. We need to support the Jews. And I'm thankful for a country that so far is supportive of the Jewish people. God's very clear about blessing them that bless them and cursing them that curse them. And so they're making a good decision here. They decide that they're going to back the Jews. Verse 5, thus the Jews smote all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, and slaughter and destruction, and did what they would unto those that hated them. And in Shushan the palace the Jews slew and destroyed 500 men. And also Angie gave me some advice earlier too. If you can't read a name, just read it fast. So we're going to go through these 10 names. And Parshandatha, and Dalphon, and Aspatha, and Portha, and Adaliah, and Aridatha, and Parmishta, and Arisiae, and Aridiae, and Vejezatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hamathadah, the enemy of the Jews, slew they. But on the spoil laid they not their hands. So we see here that the 10 sons of Haman, they were carrying on their daddy's tradition of hating the Jews and wanting to see the destruction of the Jews. Didn't work out well for them, though. They were all 10 killed. And the big difference we see here, too, is that the Israelites, although they had the right to the spoils of these people, they didn't take of the spoils. It wasn't about money for them. It wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting themselves. It was about the preservation of their culture and of their people. All right. Verse 11. On the day, the number of those that were slain in Shushan the palace was brought before the king. And the king said unto Esther the queen. Now we see a little bit of switch here, right? We don't have Esther going before the king unannounced. Now we got the king coming to Esther. He's finally learning how things really go in this world. Now he's coming to Esther going, what else can I get for you, queen? The Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan the palace, and the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is thy petition, and it shall be granted thee? Or what is thy request further, and it shall be done? Then said Esther, if it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow, also according unto today's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king commanded it so to be done, and the decree was given at Shushan, and they hanged Haman's 10 sons. So we're not really sure, once again, why Esther did this. Lots of speculation. Was she just kind of being vindictive at this point, or was she aware of a plot that was coming? I believe it was probably that she was aware of a plot that was coming, that she knew that there was, they thought, well, we're just going to go ahead and keep this going on. So she asked the king, give us another chance, give us another day to defend ourselves against these people and wipe out the people that wish us harm. And if you don't mind, let's just make a big show of this and make sure they know how powerful we are. Take those 10 guys and put them on display. Take the leaders, Haman's sons, and just make sure everyone knows that not a good idea. So the king does it. Once again, we should always expect the king to do whatever the person in front of him is telling him to do. Verse 16. Oh wait, 15. For the Jews that were in Shushan gathered themselves together on the 14th day, also of the month Adar, and slew 300 men at Shushan, but on the prey they laid not their hand. But the other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives, and had rest from their enemies, and slew of their foes 75,000. But they laid not their hands on the prey. On the 13th day of the month Adar, and on the 14th day of the same rested day, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews that were in Shushan assembled together on the 13th day thereof, and on the 14th thereof, and on the 15th day of the same they rested, and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the village that dwelt in the unwalled towns made the 14th day of the month Adar a day of gladness and feasting, and a good day, and of sending portions one to another. So here we see the continuation of that, the Jews continuing to protect themselves. They killed 75,000 throughout the land. It doesn't say how many, if any, of the Jews were killed. We don't really know, but a resounding success. Once again, continuing to see the hand of God in all of this. Continuing to see God working and protecting his people. The Jews did a great job of coming together and defending themselves and taking care of themselves. And then we'll read here verses 20 through 32. And this is the days of Purim. So Purim is named, it's a Jewish holiday. It's named after the Pur that we talked about earlier, the casting of lots. And so this holiday is a Jewish holiday. It's not a holy day. It's not considered a holy day because, but it is a Jewish holiday. So here we're going to read how Mordecai instituted this feast. And Mordecai wrote these things and sent letters unto all the Jews that were in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus, both night and day, both nigh and far, to establish this among them, that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly, every year, continuing. And it's a holiday that still continues to this day. As the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. And the Jews undertook to do as they had begun, and as Mordecai had written unto them. But Haman the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them and to destroy them. But when Esther came before the king, he commanded by letters that his wicked device, which he devised against the Jews, should return upon his own head, and that he and his sons would be hanged on the gallows. Wherefore they called the days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and which had come unto them, the Jews ordained and took upon them, and upon their seed, and upon all such as joined themselves unto them, so as it should not fail, that they would keep these 2 days according to their writing, and according to their appointed time every year. And that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Then Esther the queen, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew wrote with all authority to confirm the second letter of Purim. And he sent the letters unto all the Jews into the 127 provinces of the king Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim in their times appointed, according to as Mordecai the Jew and Esther the queen had enjoined them, and as they had decreed for themselves and for their seed the matters of the fastings and their cry. And the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. So here we see the Feast of Purim. We started out the book with a feast that was dedicated to debauchery and to power and to just a display of greed and worldly pleasure. And here we're finishing off with a feast for the Jews to remember how wickedness had tried to take them down, but God had turned it upside down on them. And that this was a feast of joy and of happiness and of sharing, helping others out, giving gifts, being nice to each other, the good things. So it's a total opposite of the way we started out the book. Same feast, whole different meaning. And then we'll read 10:1-3 real quick. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. So as we leave off, we sing King Ahasuerus still being King Ahasuerus. He levels a tax, a tribute upon the land and upon the isles of the sea. So not a whole lot has changed. King Ahasuerus hasn't learned any lessons. And as we've talked about many times throughout this book, it seems like God's not there. He's not mentioned. God was quiet. And we experience times like that in our life, where we feel like maybe God's quiet, maybe God's not there, maybe God's not doing what we want him to do. He's not yelling in our ear and showing himself standing next to us, and we can be down, and we can think that God's not around. But clearly, throughout this entire book, we've seen the hand of God working, and we can be assured that God hasn't left us. God's working on us. God's got plans for us. God is working things out in our lives. We might not ever acknowledge it. We might not ever notice it. But he is. And the biggest thing, like we talked about many times, is doesn't matter who you are or how you got to where you're at, you're here now. And God's given you opportunities. Are you going to take them? Are you going to use what God has given you in order to accomplish what God needs to accomplish? He's going to do it one way or the other. Are you going to be a part of it? And many other lessons that we can get through this in God's favor and providence and plan and growing where you're planted, and the courage and the bravery of Mordecai and Esther. And there's a lot of different things that we can pick up through here. But the biggest one is, are you letting yourself be used of God? And with that, we'll close. Let's pray. Dear Father, Lord, I thank you for this day that you've given to us. I thank you for this time that we could study your word. I thank you for the story of Esther and the book of Esther, and how we can relate that to our lives and know that even when we don't necessarily see you, we know that you're working for us and that you're working on our behalf, Lord. And just pray that you would help each and every one of us, especially as we come upon revival time here, that we would be open and receptive to your word, to your guidance, that we will be willing to be used by you, Lord. Just pray that you'd be with us, keep us safe as we all travel home tonight. We ask all these things in your name.